Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. Today we're talking about the nervous system. So within the nervous system, all the neurons in your body, there are two basic divisions. The first one is the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. The whole goal of the central nervous system is integration, taking sensory input in, understanding it, processing, and then sending information out to effectors to have things happen in response to the sensory information. The effectors are in the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system consists of all of the motor neurons. It consists of anything outside of the brain and spinal cord. There are two basic subdivisions. There is the somatic and the autonomic. The somatic nervous system receives sensory information and directs voluntary movements. This is where your motor neurons fall under. And then you have your autonomic nervous system, and there's two major divisions of that. There's the sympathetic and then the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is what we call the fight or flight. And then the parasympathetic is what we call the rest and digest. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for exciting various parts of your body and producing the response that we need to run away from a man with a knife. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is what kicks in right after Thanksgiving dinner when you've had your turkey and all you want to do is sit down and watch the Cowboys lose. Here you can see the organization of it. So overall, we have the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system receives sensory input and then puts out motor output. Over here is the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, as you can see, the main goal of this is integration. We need to integrate incoming signals and produce coordinated output. Within the motor output, we have somatic, which is voluntary, and we have autonomic, which regulates all of our automatic responses. Activities such as heart rate, breathing rate. We have the parasympathetic. This is during restful conditions, and sympathetic nervous systems prepares for stress and emergencies. The central nervous system, being your brain and spinal cord, clearly needs some type of protection. This is where all the integration occurs. So we have 4 basic ways that we protect our central nervous system. The first one is the bones of the vertebra, as well as the cranium. And then we have 3 meninges. We have the DAP, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. Now the pia mater, if you think about saran wrap, when you put saran wrap over your dinner at night and you stick it in the microwave and then you heat it up and then the saran wrap basically folds in on every little area of your food. That's the pia mater. The pia mater is basically suctioned to every sulcus and gyri of your brain. Then on top of that, you have the arachnoid, which is involved in the blood-brain barrier. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then you have the dura mater, and the dura mater is called because it's durable. It literally does not want to stretch. It doesn't want to move, and it helps maintain the cerebrospinal fluid and keep it inside. And then the other 2 are the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. All 3 are related. So the cerebrospinal fluid, this fills all of the gaps, if you will. It's in between the meninges, the ventricles, as well as it flows down through the spinal cord and then back up. Now, the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid is, number 1, shock absorption. We're going to support the brain, and then we're going to give the brain nutrients and remove waste. So your brain has neurons in 360 degrees. So they're on the top, they're in the bottom, they're inside, it's all over. Now, your brain weighs about 7 to 8 pounds, depending on a number of anatomical differences. And so your brain has very specific and important neurons on the underside. Now, if your brain was simply to rest within your cranial cavity, these neurons would get pressed on and their function would be removed, which would be very, very bad because your brainstem is around that area, which controls all of your autonomic nervous system, all of your autonomic functions. So we have cerebrospinal fluid, and your brain basically floats in your skull so that we can maintain the health and wellness of all of your neurons. So inside your brain, there are these empty spaces, if you will, that we call ventricles. There's technically 4 of them. And they are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. They move in and around, and the cerebrospinal fluid basically flows down and up and back here. This is the function, as we talked about, we need to nourish, we need to remove waste, and we also need to allow the brain to float. The blood-brain barrier is produced by tight junctions between all of the cells in the walls of the capillaries supporting the central nervous system. Now, typically, capillaries are basically like a long branching system that reaches within 4 to 6 cells of every cell in your body. Now, the difference between the blood-brain barrier and any other type of capillary network is that there are support cells, glial cells, that basically wrap around. I need you to think of like the weirdest alien wrapping around something, and that's what it is. It wraps around, and so anything that moves into the brain has to move through the blood-brain barrier first. It acts like a filter. So the function is to protect the central nervous system by only allowing select substances through and into the brain, and can inhibit life-threatening, etc., all of these massive things from getting into the brain. So one of the reasons why anytime you get a cold, or you get the flu, or you get a sinus infection, that automatically doesn't go to your brain is because the blood-brain barrier prevents it from moving into the brain. Because once you get an infection in your brain, it's very close to game over. Now, life-supporting, life-saving drugs cannot get into the brain unless they are lipid-soluble. Because remember, the cell membrane of all the cells ever is a phospholipid bilayer. And in order to get through it, it needs to be hydrophobic. And now we get to talk about the various parts of the brain. Now, the cerebrum is what you and I would classically and typically think of as the brain. This is where conscious thought occurs, where you're consciously thinking right now, oh my gosh, this lecture is getting long. You are aware of it. This accounts for 83% of the total brain weight, and it is separated into 2 hemispheres, both the right and the left. And the right hemisphere receives sensory information from the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain receives sensory information from the right side. I think I said that properly. It crosses over. Within the cerebrum, there are 2 types of matter, if you will. There are 2 types of neurons. There's gray matter and white matter. Now, the gray matter in the brain is on the most external. It is on the most superficial level of the brain, and then deep to the gray matter is the white matter. And it is called gray and white for how it looks upon microscopic inspection. The gray matter is unmyelinated axons, and as we talked about recently in lecture, unmyelinated axons, unmyelinated neurons, the signal moves slightly slower. And in this case, because these are interneurons and we're processing information coming in and deciding what to do with it on the way out, it doesn't necessarily matter that they're unmyelinated because we're not traveling meters, we're traveling a matter of centimeters. And then the white matter on the inside is myelinated axons, and this allows for communication between various parts of the brain, for the information coming in to be processed by all the different lobes, so that it can produce a feeling, so that it can produce sensation, so that it can produce perception. And then the corpus callosum is in the middle of the brain, and we'll talk more about that in class, but the corpus callosum is what allows for connection and integration between both the right and the left side of the brain. The corpus callosum is responsible for essentially allowing multitasking, and it is different sizes in men and women. And so there is a biological reason for why guys don't typically multitask as well as women. It's a thing. My husband and I giggle about that all the time. Now, the lobes of the cerebrum, we have 4 of them, and there are 4 on each side. So they separated into the right and the left lobe. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now, there are grooves in the brain. We call these sulci and gyri. Now the sulci are the grooves, and the gyri are the more worm-like looking things. So follow my cursor. So these are the gyri, and then in between them are the sulci. And the reason why the brain has this ridged appearance, if you will, is to increase the surface area. So that way, number one, the cerebrospinal fluid can get in and down in there. And number two, so that we can have more neurons, more thoughts, more ability to process. Now, the Zika virus, hot topic recently, the Zika virus, if a pregnant mother is infected with it, the infant or the fetus's brain, typically, if they do make it to term and are born, their brain will be flat and they will not have the sulci and gyri, which produces massive mental defects and the inability to process information because the surface area is not there. And here you can see all the lobes in a larger picture. So here we have the frontal association area. We're going to talk about the association areas next. We have the premotor cortex, the primary motor cortex, the primary sensory area. We call this the precentral gyrus. This is the motor cortex. And then we have the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatosensory area. And this is the central sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is the grooves or the valleys, and the gyri are the worms. That's how I describe them. And within each of these lobes, we have specific goals of what occurs here within the various portions of the brain. So the temporal lobe is right here, and it is responsible for olfaction and hearing, because again, your ears are right about here. Your occipital lobe is responsible for processing visual cues, light, basically light sensory information. In the parietal lobe, we have somatic association areas, somatic meaning voluntary movement, so muscular. As well as just between the parietal and the temporal, we have the taste or gustatory area, central sulcus, as I mentioned. And then the primary motor cortex here in the frontal lobe is that with the cerebellum, which we're about to talk about, processes and allows for fine motor coordination, large gross motor coordination, as well as the understanding of where body parts are in space and coordinated movements. Have you ever seen a 2-year-old try to walk? I call it the drunk roommate phase, where they can walk, but they do it really poorly, surprisingly poorly. They tend to run into things, they're kind of stilted, they fall down often, and I call it the drunk roommate because, hey, these are the areas that are also affected when you as an adult choose to overindulge in alcohol. So it's the primary motor cortex right here that allows for coordination and learning so that as the child ages from about 14 months up until about 3 years old, at this point, my daughter, 3 years old, is, she walks like an adult. She's much coordinated. It doesn't look odd. And, it's because learning has occurred in the primary motor cortex. And then we have the frontal association areas. We have speech here. It's very closely associated with hearing. And the frontal lobe, you may have heard about some frontal lobe diseases. And frontal lobe is partially responsible with your limbic system for producing emotions and how you react and social awareness of behaviors. So as adults, we have learned to express our feelings in more constructive ways, whereas children will just all out let it hang out. And it's because the frontal lobe is still developing. There are thoughts, and recent research has shown that ADHD, ADD, is associated with a slow-growing frontal cortex, frontal lobe. And the reason why, so if you think about ADD, ADHD, they do have patients with ADD and ADHD have impulse control. They typically want lots of movement. They can't control their body as well as other patients. And the reason why is their frontal lobe is still developing. That was a really interesting finding that I read recently. And then we have areas, and the areas are what we refer to as, they're not a specific, you can't pinpoint them specifically in the brain. It's just localized in this particular area of a lobe or between lobes, etc. So we have the primary somatosensory area, and this is what receives sensory information from the body and helps process it throughout the various lobes. We have the motor areas. We have the primary motor area, primary motor cortex, controls skeletal muscles, and the premotor cortex coordinates learned motor skills. Walking, driving, writing, talking is a learned motor skill. And then we have the association areas. Now, the association areas become very important, where we take information from one area that comes in and we put it through another area so that we can make sense of all of the information coming in and produce a learned response or a robust response. And the prefrontal cortex is what allows us to reason and think. Again, which is why frontal lobe injuries, because it can harm the prefrontal cortex, can prevent learning, it can prevent logical thought, and can prevent reasoning. This weird picture is what we call a homunculus. So remember we talked about the central sulcus, and then we have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. This is the primary motor cortex, and this is the primary somatosensory area. And you can look, the gyrus is separated over here, and you can see all of these weird looking faces. Now this homunculus here is where it shows you all of these areas are associated with the various areas in the brain. So over here, just above your ear, you can see that this is the area that controls your tongue. And then we move a little bit farther up, right about here, and we get the lips, the face, the brow, the nose, etc. We move a little bit higher. Here's where your fingers, your arm, elbow, neck, trunk, we get, which is interesting that it's at the curve. This is the knee. And we move down into the longitudinal fissure, and we get to the leg. Now, you can see that the primary motor area, we have a large amount of the primary motor cortex associated with the lips and the jaw and the face. This is to produce the fine motor coordination to talk. Up here, you can see the hand is huge compared to the elbow, wrist, arm, neck, etc., trunk, leg, knee, toes. And the fingers have extremely fine motor control. As we talked about, they have very few muscle cells per motor unit. So there's a lot of motor units giving us lots of fine motor control. It's controlled right here. And then if we look over here in the primary somatosensory area, this is where sensory input is brought in and processed. So again, you can see that it's very familiar. The teeth in this area do have sensory input, and if you've ever had sensitive teeth, you are acutely aware of that. You can see the tongue and the pharynx. These do have sensory information. Lips, nose, eye. You can see a large hand as well. Trunk, neck, knee, foot, and toes, all the way down in genitals, all the way down in the middle. Now, moving on to different parts of the brain, we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, we've already introduced the thalamus a little bit in class. I like to call the thalamus the angry secretary. This serves as the relay station for all of the sensory information with the exception of smell. Now, this also can direct motor activity as well as help you recall memories. The thalamus, basically, you can see it right here. So here's your spinal cord. It comes up through the midbrain, which the brainstem, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then we get to the thalamus. And before it goes to the rest of the brain, to the cerebrum, and to all the various other portions, it hits the thalamus. And the thalamus decides, okay, this sensory information is important. I'm going to send it to this area of the brain. Or it decides, no, the sensory information that's incoming in this area is not as important as others. I don't need to make the brain aware of it at this time. And it's the thalamus that allows for sensory adaptation, which we experimented with in lab. by putting pennies on the back of our hand and seeing how long it took us not to feel it. Which is why at any point in the day, you're not acutely aware of the feeling of your pants on your body or the feeling of your chair on your bottom. You are aware of it, but it's not something that you continually feel. It's not at the forefront of your brain and important. Then your hypothalamus, this is our homeostasis regulating portion of the brain. It regulates blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate, digestion, body temperature, and it does this in coordination with a lot of the brainstem, which we're about to talk about. It also coordinates nervous and endocrine systems. It influences the pituitary, by which it's it's the hypothalamic portal tract that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. The hypothalamus also has a number of hormones that help regulate the pituitary and the hormones that the pituitary releases in turn. It also plays a role in the limbic system by helping to regulate emotions. And then we have the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum, I remember what this does because I think Sarah balances. It looks like a bun just tucked right up under here, under your cerebrum. And this is where we have proprioception. Proprioception is the ability of your brain to be aware of where your limbs are in space. So right now, you might be sitting down and you are aware that your legs are in a seated position and your feet may or may not be on the ground. You may have your legs crossed. It's the job of your cerebellum to process this, to send this to your cerebrum for you to be aware and conscious of what your limbs are doing. It also helps us produce smooth, voluntary movements. We addressed this in one of my classes today. We talked about Parkinson's and how in Parkinson's, typically one of the at the molecular level with Parkinson's, there's a number of other things that happen, but one of them is that it's a decrease in dopamine. Now, dopamine in the cerebellum allows for smooth, controlled movements, whereas without that and without activation of the cerebellum, that's why the shaking is produced as a movement is trying to occur. I was sitting in a lecture hall the other day, and I looked over to see an older woman, and it looked like she was nodding furiously with, yes, I agree with what is happening in this lecture. And as I looked a little longer, I realized that the nodding is probably early signs of Parkinson's that she can't control because she's trying to hold her head in an upright position. The cerebellum also allows us to compare where our body actually is compared to where we perceive that it is. And then it also helps us to predict where things are going to be. For example, if you're walking across a parking lot, your eyes can see cracks in the parking lot. Your eyes can perceive a difference in texture of the road as you move from the blacktop onto the xeriscaped portion. Your eyes bring that visual information in, processed in the occipital lobe, and the cerebellum will allow for calculations to be made so that way you don't hit the rocks and eat it, and you don't miss the curb as you step up. It allows you to predict where your limbs should be in space at a different time. And as well controls equilibrium and posture. Now, equilibrium, in this instance, we're not talking about chemical equilibrium, such as diffusion. We're talking about equilibrium, the ability to stand upright and not want to vomit, essentially. Equilibrium is aided by your inner ear, which we will talk about in the next lecture. And then we get to the brainstem, and the brainstem is right here in the middle of the brain. We have the thalamus, it's our angry secretary. We have the midbrain, we have the pons, we have the medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord bringing information in and shooting information out. Now, the medulla oblongata has reflex centers, the apneustic reflex center, and the pneumotaxic, which are just very fancy words for controlling breathing and heart rate. It also can control blood pressure. The midbrain, looking right here, it processes information about sights and sounds, and this is where your reflex center is. So, for example, did any of you jump when I just did that? That is your midbrain saying, oh, that was a sudden, unexpected sound. I don't know what to do about that. And it causes a jump and probably triggered a little bit of your sympathetic nervous system as well, which we're about to talk about. And then the pons is the bridge. It connects the spinal cord, the cerebellum, the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. This also assists the medulla oblongata with regulating your respiration rate. So we have a number of systems within the brain. There's two major ones, the limbic system, which is the seat of our emotions, and then the reticular activating system, which wakes us up and puts us to sleep. Now, the limbic system is, you can see that there's components of it all over the brain. And the limbic system helps us process emotions, process the incoming sensory information, and form a feeling regarding it. So, for example, I'm about to post your practical grades, and your practical grades, if you think about it, all it is visual information. You will see a number on the screen, and then your brain will recognize and say, oh, that is a 70 out of 75. And then it will bounce between the various areas of your brain, and eventually you will settle on an emotion. Now, some of you might not settle on an emotion, and good for you. But that's what your limbic system does. Your reticular activating system has a network extensive throughout the entire brain and projects to the central cortex. And this is what allows you to wake up and then to fall asleep. It filters sensory input and keeps the cerebral cortex in an alert state. Why do you think it's so common in bedrooms, especially hotels, to have blackout curtains? Because that is visual sensory information that triggers in your reticular activating system to say, oh, it's daytime, I should wake up. Now, for those of you in my 8 o'clock class, I might need some brighter lights for you. I love you. We might need brighter lights to activate your reticular activating system. The same thing happens when you fall asleep and there is a loud noise. Your reticular activating system is triggered and says, oh, there is a stimulus. I must process it and see what is going on. And then memory. Now, we've already talked about how your brain works in terms of memory because I talked to you about this on the first day, because this is how I teach. I teach on the basis of neurobiology. So if you look here, we have environmental stimuli, and then we have sensory memory. We can store senses, how touch, hearing, vision, etc. And information you do not attend to is lost. Any information that you do not think about, that you do not send through that synaptic network is going to be lost, which is my goal for you when you hear and see this lecture, that we have our first encounter. Then we process the information. My goal is that you are both taking notes and thinking about this information as I'm telling it to you, and that the short-term memory, as you rehearse it, it moves through the short-term memory circuit. And if you do not continue to rehearse this information, and by rehearse I mean going over it, either looking at your notes, listening to the lecture again, coming to class, participating in our in-class activities, then this information will be lost. So my goal with this, the flipped classroom, is that here, we're starting here. You will then look at your notes before class and then in-class activities. And then as you study, this information is moved into long-term memory. Now, once information is moved into long-term memory, you can then play with it a little bit. It can become malleable. And that is what helps us move into analysis, understanding, and application of the material. So it's not just rote short-term memory. This is the definition of this. This is the definition of this. It is actually, oh, this is the definition of this, and this is how it directly affects me. That's my goal in teaching you this way this semester. Short-term memory can hold information for a very short period of time, usually not a period of weeks, which is how long we need to retain information if your goal is just to do well on the test. If your goal is to just do well on the test, then I will address that later. But your goal should be to retain this information over a lifetime. And to move it into long-term memory, this is a limitless amount of information. Basically, your computer has an unlimited number of gigabytes available. It's never going to fill up. However, if you don't use the information, it really is a use it or lose it mentality. You either use that information or it's removed from your brain. And then we have the spinal cord, which is our reflex center. This is where we have some integration. It's a neural tube with a central canal in between the vertebra. And the function is to conduct messages from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system so that it can be processed, decisions can be made, and motor output can be released back down through the spinal cord. A reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus with a pre-wired circuit. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if you were to step on something ouchy, your foot would automatically withdraw. You would not have to step on it, hold your foot there for a second and think, oh gosh, that hurts. I think maybe I shouldn't be stepping on this. No, your reflex is that your foot immediately withdraws. The parts of a circuit are, number one, the receptor, the pain receptors in your foot stepping on that tiny, tiny Lego. The sensory neuron saying, oh, no. The interneuron, there's at least one interneuron, and typically in a spinal reflex arc, there's only one. The sensory information coming in, the interneuron connecting them, and the motor output. And then the motor neuron that moves the information directly to the motor neuron, and then the effector, which is the muscle. Spinal reflexes are decisions made by the spinal cord without any processing from the brain. And this is in things like hot, cold, pain, etc. For example, if you touch a hot pizza thing, your hand will immediately withdraw. You're not going to keep your hand there. And this is an evolutionary trait that allows us to protect ourselves. And then we have spinal nerves. These are nerves that originate from the spinal cord. And we have cranial nerves that originate from the cranium. And you can see this structure of the spinal cord here, as well as the structure of the cranial nerves here. Now, we don't have very much on the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has both the somatic and the autonomic. So the peripheral nervous system is basically everything outside of your brain and spinal cord, which you'd think it would get more play in this lecture, but we talk more about it when we get to the senses as well. Now, the somatic nervous system governs conscious thought and voluntary movements. Walking, talking, I'm thinking this way. The autonomic nervous system is everything that's unconscious that you don't necessarily think about. And aren't we thankful? Because if we thought about breathing, we probably would forget to do it. I mean, let's be real. If we had to think every time for our heart to beat, we would be overwhelmed with just thinking about our heart to beat. And then within this, we have two divisions of the autonomic nervous system that affect all of our involuntary processes. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for a fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system prepares your body to rest and digest, to sleep, to calm down. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is triggered every time you're driving, and you may or may not be going slightly over the speed limit, and all of a sudden you see some lights in your mirror. And all of a sudden, your heart feels like it's in your throat, your stomach feels like it's falling out, and you may feel kind of slightly sick. And all of a sudden you feel your heart racing, all of a sudden you can see really well, and you might get a little sweaty. That is your sympathetic nervous system preparing you in the event of an emergency, which lights in your rearview mirror are not necessarily an emergency, but your brain doesn't know that. Your brain just thinks, oh crap! And then the parasympathetic nervous system is what happens every night when you lay down or after you sit down after you eat your evening meal. And this allows the body to pull the blood from the muscles, put it in the gut, so that way things can be absorbed really well and the body can get nutrition and sleep and everything it needs to process well. These are antagonistic. So usually every organ has both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. And depending on the needs of the body, they will be triggered in either direction. And this is a video that I will be posting for you online. And that's it for today. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Human Biology with Dr. B. See you next time.